Tonight on Perspectives. Russia denies it knew anything about an Iranian military base in Syria, from where Israel claims Iran sent a drone into the Jewish state's airspace. 2 Israeli soldiers come under attack in the West Bank city of Jenin after following a navigation application leading them into hostile territory. And have the Winter Olympics unfrozen direct talks between the Korean leaders? Under what conditions would the South accept an invitation to meet with Kim Jong-un after his sister extends the offer on his behalf?
Good afternoon, New York. Good evening, Tel Aviv. I'm Tracy Alexander. Thank you for joining us here on Perspectives. Russia's foreign ministry says it has no information that Iran has a military base in Syria near Palmyra. This base is also known as T4. The admission comes after Israel says it detected an Iranian drone in its airspace early Saturday morning, originally launched from that Palmyra base. Now, the drone detection prompted a barrage of Israeli airstrikes on Iranian and Syrian targets inside Syria. Syria responded with heavy anti-aircraft fire that set off multiple warning sirens in Israel and managed to down 1 Israeli F-16 jet inside Israeli territory, seriously wounding a pilot. It's believed to be the first time Israel has lost a jet in combat since 2006. So how did it happen? Well, what we know is that while 4 jets were sent into Syria to carry out the mission, flying under Syria's detection radar, another 4 were sent to patrol the skies, flying at higher altitude. It was one of these that was hit by the shrapnel of an SA-17 missile. Our senior defence correspondent Shai Ben-Ari explains.
In this force of 8 jets that targeted T4, 4 of them flew at a lower altitude, and these actually targeted the controlling facility, the controlling vehicle that operated the drone, which infiltrated into Israel, while other planes remained at a higher altitude. And it was one of these that was eventually hit or damaged, let's say, by an SA-17 missile that was fired in its direction. The missile itself exploded near the jet, while it was already back, returning home, already in Israeli territory. We understand that it was flying at a fairly high altitude that perhaps made it more vulnerable, and there's some question over whether the pilots actually used the proper maneuvers in terms of evasive maneuvering or the proper measures to try and get away from that missile. Of course, the 7 other jets in that initial strike were not harmed by the various missiles fired at them. And we're also talking about a second round of strikes that came later against 12 different targets in Syria, both Iranian targets and Syrian targets. All the jets that participated in that second round of strikes returned safely home, despite some 15-20 missiles being fired at them. There is a concern here for Israel in general and the Air Force in particular when you talk about this being the first case of an Israeli plane being damaged or let alone downed altogether over Syria in the context of the past few years, the context of the Syrian conflict and the effort by Israel to prevent Hezbollah weapons transfers, weapons falling into the hands of Hezbollah there. There's a psychological impact that has to be said here. Does this mean that there will now be problems for future Israeli strikes in Syrian territory? Has the game changed? Will we see a similar response in terms of Syrian air defense measures to any sort of Israeli activity in the skies above that country? It's also important to note that Israel has already put in effect a certain effort to build a new array of surface-to-surface missiles, which will, of course, make it unnecessary to risk Israeli jets over Syrian airspace.
Now, today, an official in Tehran says that Iran will continue backing the Syrian government and that the downing of the Israeli jet was, quote, a milestone in the history of the Palestinian struggle. Israeli parliament member and former Foreign Affairs Minister Tzipi Livni saying the threat of Iran calls for a more active role of the United States in the Middle East.
Yes, I think it's time for the U.S. to come back to the region. We need it, and we need an understanding between the U.S., Russia, Europe, and everybody else that having in Iran getting a regional superpower in a way, abusing the weakness of Assad and having their proxy Hezbollah in Lebanon, this is something that is not acceptable.
For more, I'm joined in studio by Middle East and geopolitical analyst Matthew Brodsky. Matthew, great to have you with us here in Israel.
Good to be with you.
Now, going back to Russia's part in this, we know that it's claiming it had no idea that an Iranian military base was in Syria. How then can Israel trust Russia is protecting its interests if it's not aware of a base right under its nose, so to speak?
Well, it isn't. Russia's looking after only its own interests, and it uses Iran to the extent that the goals that they share align. But there's a lot of areas that they don't align. For Russia, basically, it doesn't matter how often Netanyahu is going to speak to Putin. He'll smile, say the right thing, and it'll be a different situation on the ground. The same is what the United States is finding also in eastern Syria when it comes to Russia. So, I mean, Russia has a presence at the T4 base to begin with. So we know that they're aware of it, and I'm sure that they knew that Iran was going to carry off this type of mission. If not, it shows that Iran doesn't feel that it needs to check with its overlord, Russia, to carry out such an attack.
So then, looking at the fact that this has managed in the end to perhaps by mere fluke down an Israeli jet, perhaps it was a matter of how they were carrying out that operation. Do you see this having an impact on how Israel in the future, as Shai pointed to, targets the moving of weapons from Lebanon, Syria into Lebanon, where Hezbollah is situated?
I think the important part for Israel, first of all, to lose only one jet in some 35 years is an unbelievable record that any country that has to fly the amount of sorties that Israel does would be very proud of. That's number one. Number two, what this does is it may widen what Israel feels that it can strike and that it has the leeway to strike without having to set the diplomatic groundwork for. So before, it was game-changing weapons, perhaps anything that Iran was bringing in that could help with its nuclear program even, or missiles that would make what Hezbollah has more accurate. Right now, they could extend that to drones because they see that that's also a growing threat.
Right. Now, we heard Tzipi Livni saying that she believes that the United States need to take a more active role. We know that this is all unfolding as US Defence Secretary Rex Tillerson is in the region. Now, he'll be visiting over 5 days Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, Egypt and Kuwait. When he visits Lebanon, he's expected to press officials about reining in Hezbollah. How much impact do you think that will really have?
Zero. I mean, if the Lebanese themselves can keep a straight face throughout the meeting before erupting in laughter after hearing that request, that would be a positive sign, I suppose, from a Lebanese perspective. The United States policy, unfortunately, with Lebanon is by default a pro-Iranian policy. To give weapons to the LAF is essentially to give weapons to Hezbollah. They are guarding their hind flank. So it's a horrible, disastrous policy right now. As to what Livni said about the United States being involved more in the region, Trump's voters won't like to hear it, but yes, the U.S. has a bigger role to play.
All right, now we know that Tillerson's in Egypt. Here's a bit of what he had to say about fighting ISIS and Egypt's upcoming election. Take a listen.
We agreed that we would continue our close cooperation on counterterrorism measures, including our joint commitment to the defeat of ISIS. And Egypt has been a very important member of the Defeat ISIS coalition from the beginning. We have always advocated for free and fair elections, transparent elections, not just for Egypt, but in any country.
So how can Tillerson balance the United States' interest in seeing Egypt as an ally in fighting terrorism and its calls or worries around democracy and civil rights in the region?
Well, this is the age-old question for the United States. How can it deal with getting Egypt more toward democratic norms so that it's not going to face the kind of uprising that brought down Mubarak? The short answer really is I don't think the United States can. And I think that the Trump administration, more than any other administration, will let that fall by the wayside. I think they're a lot more interested in stability, and stability that's friends with the U.S.
All right. Well, critics are saying, or analysts are saying rather, that he's yet to face his biggest challenge when he visits Ankara in Turkey. Matthew Brodsky will be following that as it unfolds. All right, coming up here on Perspectives, the fallout continues following Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's claims that he spoke with US officials about the controversial West Bank annexation bill. What the US is saying today, plus we take an in-depth look into that terrible incident near Jenin. 2 soldiers attacked. What were they doing there? Those stories and more when Perspectives continues. Stay here.